Then explain to me why. Bobby Parks' wife is in witness protection, and she testifies before the Organized Crime Commission that she overheard a conversation between her husband and her husband's brother, that he went to kill a guy, and the guy's family walked in on him, and he killed the guy's family. What other case is that? There's only one case like that in, 40, 50 years in Youngstown, and that's the Marsh killing.
You're watching an amazing podcast from an amazing podcast company.
Hello, everybody. My name is Johnny Chechitelli, and welcome to a special edition of Youngstown Mob Talk. Today's episode is a continuation of a special investigation that I've been conducting into a brutal murder case from the 1970s, the Marsh murders. Now, if you haven't already, please check out previous episodes we've done on this investigation, starting with an episode I did with author Gary Bonnell. Great episode, gives a lot of background into the Marsh murders. Gary actually wrote a book called Truth Not Deception that details the whole thing. He worked at the GM Lordstown plant with Benjamin Marsh and had a lot of insight into this case, including the trial transcripts that from the eventual trial that took place many years later. So again, please watch that episode. It's on YouTube, or you can listen to it on Apple and Spotify or iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcasts. It's Youngstown Mob Talk, the episode with Gary Bonnell. So definitely check that out. And also check out part 2 of the investigation. We did, Jimmy Naples and I did a whole breakdown of Bobby Parks. Now, Bobby Parks was a hitman-for-hire in the Youngstown area, the 60s and the 70s. So definitely check that episode out because it all links together and it leads into today's episode. Today's episode, I'll give you a quick recap of the Marsh murders and where we're at in the investigation to this point. In 1974, Benjamin Marsh was a nighttime security guard. He was the overnight security guard at the General Motors Lordstown plant. This was a huge plant that ran for many years just outside of Youngstown in a township called Lordstown, and this was a big employer in this area. I believe at this time in the 70s, 13,000 people. They made different cars, different parts, all that stuff at this big plant out there that was owned by General Motors. Now, Benjamin Marsh, being the security guard, ended up discovering that there were drugs being run out of General Motors. Gary Bonnell, in our previous episode, discusses how Benjamin found cocaine being shipped out of the vans that were being made at that time at the plant. And Benjamin then brought these drugs to his superiors, continued a kind of an investigation into this, and eventually became an informant for law enforcement. He was to testify before a grand jury on the matter. There was also other criminal activity that he was testifying to that was taking place at the General Motors plant. And unfortunately for everyone involved in this, the powers that be did not want this trial to go forth. So a hitman was hired to kill Benjamin Marsh. Now, the killing actually occurred in his Canfield Township home while he was sleeping. He came home one morning after work. He went to bed, and he was all alone. That's when the killer broke into his garage, broke in from a window on the outside of the garage door, ended up walking through the garage, kicked in the door to the kitchen, the house, walks into the house, finds Benjamin Marsh sleeping in his bed, and proceeds to murder him. He shoots him a few times, and pretty vicious stuff. It was during this killing when Benjamin Marsh's family actually returned home. His wife, Marilyn, took their 2 young children. She had an infant son named Christopher and a 4-year-old daughter named Heather. Well, the killer proceeds to shoot and kill Marilyn Marsh, Ben's wife, and then very heinously um, kills young Heather Marsh as well. Actually, beat her with the butt of the gun. Um, he did not harm the baby. The killer did not kill the baby or harm the baby at all. He actually left. The poor child was left, for hours and hours, crawl around in the crime scene, in the blood in the crime scene. It's really tragic, horrific stuff. So an investigation was held by local law enforcement. At the time, an investigator from the sheriff's department, the Mahoney County Sheriff's Department, um, named Ed Nemeth, was in charge. He had a lead suspect named Bobby Parks, and we have his whole case file, his whole investigation. He really believed it was Bobby Parks that was behind this. He had different evidence to believe that, or leads, I should say, to point him in that direction. At one point, he ends up doing a sting operation because they created, and when I say they, Ed Nemeth also partnered with the GM security team to investigate this, which I found a little odd. I didn't expect a police force to, really team up with a private corporation security team to do this murder. You would think it would be, especially by today's standards, just the law enforcement, strictly law enforcement. Back then, Ed Nemeth was with a guy named Wayne McIntosh from General Motors, and they were kind of doing this joint investigation into the killings of Ben Marsh and his family. So they ended up developing a few leads, and they had someone who was providing kind of witness statements. They didn't see the crime, but they had heard some things, and this was all in a file that Mr. McIntosh kept. Well, he got a tip that someone was going to steal his file. They were actually going to steal this police file. So with the witness name on it. Well, he confers with Ed Nemeth, and they actually came up with a good plan, which was to create a dummy file. And where on this file they put on a fake name of a fictitious witness. And they said that this person was staying at the Penn, Ohio hotel, and that he was out here, being kind of sequestered, you would say, before there could be a trial or a grand jury. So this dummy file was kept in Mr. McIntosh's car on the General Motors Lordstown plant parking lot, and sure enough, that car was broken into, and that dummy file was stolen. So now Nemeth has to be thinking, okay, this plan is working. We can do a sting operation here. So Nemeth actually goes to the hotel and pretends to be this fake witness. He's staying in a room at the hotel. It's being guarded by other sheriff's deputies. And for a couple days, Nemeth is at this hotel and nothing happens. Well, I believe it was on the third day, he gets a phone call, and there's a man breathing heavily on the other end, and he kind of just tells him, "Don't go anywhere." Well, sure enough, that's the sign. Something's going to happen. So the police are all guarding it. They're all watching. 3 men show up to this hotel room, and they knock on the door. As soon as Ed Nemeth opens the door, the other officers jump out, and they arrest these 3 men. Now, the 3 men arrested were Bobby Parks, his brother Paul Parks, and an associate of theirs named Ed Ferris, who was a former sheriff's deputy turned criminal figure who would later come up in a lot of other cases and investigations, be they murders and burglaries and everything. These were, 3 bad guys here. Bobby Parks was a hitman for hire. And again, if you haven't watched our previous episode, we do a whole breakdown of who Bobby Parks was. Really kind of a sociopath and just a professional killer. He actually had business cards that said "Have gun, will travel." So he was a professional killer. And anyways, these 3 guys are arrested at this hotel. This would have been early 1975 during the initial investigation. No charges are ever brought. Their lawyer, at the time, a very famous lawyer in town, Mr. Carmen Policy, who would go on to become president of the 49ers and the Cleveland Browns, and had a very successful career as an NFL executive. At the time, he was a lawyer, a defense lawyer in Youngstown. He represented some guys like local mob boss Joey Naples, some other folks as well. He was a very prominent lawyer. He shows up and gets these guys, basically says, if you're not charging these guys with a crime, they're free to go. So Bobby Parks, Paul Parks, and Ed Ferris walk out of there that day, and no charges are ever brought. They said that in the official report, it said, well, they were unarmed, so they had no reason to hold them. Well, years later, we ended up talking with a retired now police officer from the Salem Police Department, Dave Talbert. And Talbert's father was a fence back in the 1970s who was actually killed by Bobby Parks. So Dave Talbert has been investigating Bobby Parks for years and years, and talked to Ed Nemeth, his brother. Him and his brother had been investigating their father's murder. Talbert's brother actually talked to Ed Nemeth years ago. Well, Ed Nemeth has long since died, but this would have been, maybe 20 years ago or so. Dave Talbert's brother talked to Ed Nemeth and asked him about that night that Bobby Parks showed up to the hotel. Well, what's interesting is Ed Nemeth told him something that's not in the report. Ed Nemeth told him that he had a sawed-off shotgun. Bobby Parks had a trench coat on with a sawed-off shotgun underneath. So there's no doubt in my mind they were coming to kill that witness. Well, unfortunately, no charges were ever brought against Bobby Parks, and the case went cold. Now in 2009, 35 years after these brutal killings took place, some cold case detectives with the Mahoning County Sheriff's Office got a break in the case. They told the media that on a hunch, they ran the prints retrieved from the crime scene through their law enforcement database, and one came back matching James Ferrara. Through my own investigation and after talking with Ferrara, I think it may have been more than a hunch. Ferrara believes that a man named Joseph Perry Sr. gave them his name as a lead to get a lighter sentence in a case that he was involved with at that same time, 2008, 2009. The reason I think this theory may be true is because Joseph Perry Sr. had been accused of a serious crime, kidnapping and assault, and the prosecutor's office was only recommending 30 days in jail. Now, he ended up doing a year, but I also found in my investigation that Joseph Perry was on the witness list in Ferrara's trial as a witness for the prosecution, though he was never called to testify. So the end result was that the detectives would go on to investigate James Ferrara, who was already serving a life sentence. He had worked at General Motors in the 70s. He was serving a life sentence for the murder of two men in Columbus, which was a drug robbery gone wrong. Ferrara talked with another person, a GM. They brought Ferrara on as muscle. They went down to Columbus. The plan was to rob two drug dealers of a large amount of cocaine. Ferrara brought a gun. They walked into this room, tried to rob these guys. A fight ended up ensuing, and Ferrara, using his own words, shot his way out. These guys were quickly caught. This was James Ferrara, Mark Jennings, and a gentleman named Joey Weeks. These guys were all caught, and Ferrara admitted it. They all pled guilty. Ferrara said, I shot my way out, and he was given a life sentence with the opportunity for parole after 20 years. So I say that because now, just to give you a little background, you have a guy who's in prison for killing two people. He had worked at GM. He was never a suspect in the initial investigation into the Marsh case. His name had never come up, and was just never regarded as a suspect in the case. James Ferrara was a Vietnam veteran. I've done a lot of personal background information, investigation on him, followed leads, followed people that worked with him, that knew him, people from his personal life as well. And they all told me the same thing. They all said James Ferrara never got in any trouble until that stuff that happened in Columbus. So, you know, James was, as I mentioned, a Vietnam veteran, um, but no signs of any criminal background in his adult life. I think he had been uh, had a charge of burglary tolls or something when he was a teenager in Michigan, but it never went to trial or anything like that. So he never really had a criminal background at all, and claims to this day that he did not kill the Marsh family, that he was not there, and that um, these charges were false against him, and eventually the conviction against him was false. So he was tried in 2013, several years after they initially got this tip that he was involved. They ran his fingerprints, and they said that they matched a fingerprint of his from when they, back from the actual scene at the Marsh house in Canfield. They said that they found one of his fingerprints outside the door, the garage door. Lots of evidence was found inside the house, cigarette butts, other fingerprints, stuff that could probably be tested for DNA today if they kept the evidence. I'm not sure, but there's a lot of things they found in the house. None of it ever led back to Ferrara. There's no evidence at all that he was ever in that house, yet alone that he killed those people. So I tell you all that to bring you back to the murder scene now. The killer's in the house. He kills Benjamin Marsh. The family comes home. He kills them. He leaves the baby. But he actually took Mrs. Marsh's car, took her car from the garage and drove it to a nearby township, Austintown Township, and left it in the parking lot of a Kmart. So whoever killed them must have been dropped off at this house because it was winter time. It was snow. There was snow outside, and it would have been too remote to walk to. So somebody brought the killer there. That's why they took the car and they left. So by 2013, James Ferrara is finally charged officially and brought back to Mahoning County to stand trial. That's where things get a little bit interesting as well. During the actual trial, he the whole time has maintained his innocence. He pleaded not guilty, says he never did these things, but they had a fingerprint from outside the door, largely as their only evidence in this whole case. Then, during the trial, somebody actually comes onto the witness stand and offers testimony for the prosecution that it was a relatively young, new sheriff's deputy who had just finished his training, and was, working as a guard at the Mahoning County Jail, when he says that Ferrara randomly approached him and somehow knew that he had just finished his training courses. And so he starts talking to him about weapons and about guns. According to this deputy, Ferrara just offered up the information of that he liked to use 38 specials, 38 caliber revolver, because they didn't leave any shells. That's what this deputy testified to on the stand, saying that Ferrara said this to him completely unprovoked, just offered up this information and, basically incriminated himself almost. So um, a report was made by a Detective Mondora, and that took the information from this deputy, and that was ended up used as evidence in the trial. So that statement, along with a fingerprint found outside the door, was largely the only evidence brought brought up in the trial and used against Ferrara. Now, at the end of the trial, and you can read these transcripts too, by the way, at truthnotdeception.com, author Gary Bonnell has actually put all of this stuff up for download. You can check it out yourselves, and it's all out there. So you can read everything here that I'm kind of summarizing. But at the very end of the trial, the prosecutor had their closing arguments. The defense presented their closing arguments, and the prosecution had a final rebuttal. The last thing that they said before the case went to the jury. In those final rebuttal statements, the prosecutor said something that was just not true. They said that James Ferrara killed the Marshes and then took their car and drove it to the Kmart parking lot in Austintown and left it there because he lived very close by in an apartment in Austintown. Well, this was 1974, and I've since gone back and have looked in the library records. We've also had a private investigator do the same thing, go through files and find where Ferrara lived at that time. Jim says that he didn't live in Austintown until 1976. At the time, he was living closer to Warren and closer to his job at Lordstown. He was staying, I believe it was a Dolly Madison motel and also an apartment complex in Warren. Now, there's records that are out there from the 70s that show where people lived, and they had their address. And sure enough, and these records go every other year, but they show that he lived in these places in Warren, and he was staying at that hotel. He didn't move into the apartment in Austintown until 1976. So that statement that was brought up at the very end of the trial, the last thing the jury heard was that this guy, killed these people, brought this car to a parking lot nearby his house, and he just walked home. Well, we later showed that was not true in our investigation. So again, these are all the things that the jury took with them, and you've got a guy who's a convicted killer. He's already serving a life sentence. He worked at GM. They said they had a fingerprint outside the house. These other statements that were made, the statement supposedly that he said to the guard about his weapon of choice, and now this last element that was brought up by the prosecution that showed, that there's an explanation as to why they just left the car at this random parking lot and then he walked to his apartment. So that was everything used, and you can see, a jury, they found him guilty. They found James Ferrara guilty. James, I've talked to him a lot now over the last year. I've kept an open mind. I try to say, okay, I don't know if he's innocent. I don't know if he's guilty. I'm talking with him, trying to decipher, what's the truth? Is he telling me the truth? Everything he's told me, I've independently verified. So as far as his background and who he was, what kind of person he was, the fact that he never wavered in his maintaining his innocence. This is a guy again who did plead guilty to shooting those two guys in Columbus in that drug deal gone bad. Denied this case from day one. So it was compelling. But I said, you know what? There's one thing to talk to this guy on the phone. It's another to look him in the eyes when you talk to him. So I filed a request with Marion Correctional Institute, the prison down there, and they let me come down and they let me bring a camera. And what you're going to hear now is an interview I did with James Ferrara. This was after, of course, and I'm leaving a big part out here that we talked about in our previous episode, the Bobby Parks episode. During some of my investigation, I was actually given documents from an organized crime task force from the early 2000s. And in that ream of paperwork that I got in their investigations from this task force, they were investigating the murder of Rob Talbert, gentleman I mentioned earlier, who was a fence for some mafia-related figures and some crime figures in the 70s. Well, during their investigation, they went to these investigators, these detectives from Akron and Copley and other departments far from Youngstown, because this organized crime task force didn't trust Youngstown officers. They didn't know who was involved in what. So this task force comprised of officers from outside of Mahoning County. These officers then these detectives go all the way to California and talk to Bobby Parks's ex-wife, Elizabeth Parks, who at the time was in witness protection program. She moved out to California after she testified against her husband in another murder case from the 1970s, the late 1970s. And in that case, her testimony really brought him down and put him away for life. He had killed he was hired to kill a doctor here locally, and the doctor's wife, his new wife, he ended up shooting the doctor, wounding him, killed the new wife, and also killed one of the doctor's nurses. And he ended up going to prison, serving 2 life sentences for that crime. Bobby Parks eventually died in prison, but his ex-wife, Liz Parks, she was the one who really put him away because her testimony was damning. The things she said that he admitted to her, that he openly talked about a lot of these murders. Well, during this organized crime task force investigation in the 2000s, they go to California and they ask her at one point, did Bobby ever talk about any other murders? Did you ever hear about any other murders? And she says, yeah, there was actually one where he talked about killing this guy because of his job. He was hired to kill a guy because of the guy's job. She didn't know what the job was, but she said that much. And then she also said that he admitted that after he killed this guy, the guy's family came home, and that he killed the wife, and that he killed the little girl. And she even knew that he beat her with the butt of the gun. Liz Parks tells these detectives this. And at the time, you have to keep in mind, they're not investigating the Marsh case. That was not one of the cases they were openly investigating. So they didn't really have the background information on that case, but they did ask one follow-up question. They said, what year was this that you heard Bobby talk about this murder? And she said it was 1976 that she heard Bobby tell her talk about that Marsh killing. Well, of course, you look back at the cases locally and around here, that the Marsh killings are the only ones that fit that description. And they were in 1974, so the timeline works out. Now, in their investigation, in their interviews with Liz Parks, they moved on to other topics and other murders because they talked to her for hours and hours. But that part was never brought back up, and nothing ever came of it. So, if that's true and these other things are true, then you've got an innocent man convicted of killing the Marsh family. It's shocking kind of what's out there when you follow these leads and these crumbs. But we have new evidence now. Liz Parks's words, which were enough to put Bobby away for life. She has since died. I found out that she's died during COVID just a few years ago. But the sheriff's department has her interview. They have a tape with her. They have the transcript. They have it all. She says it right there. None of this was ever given to James Ferrara or his defense. So, key evidence here from that trial, none of it was ever brought up in the trial or given to the jury. So, did they even know about this interview? Did law enforcement know? Who knows at this point? But I said, you know what? I'm going to show this to James Ferrara. As I mentioned before, I talked to him several times on the phone, but it's another thing entirely to look somebody in the eyes. You don't know if somebody's lying. They could be an expert liar, especially criminal. A lot of criminals could be expert liars, and they're good at that. So I try to keep an open mind. And I say, okay, I'm not going in thinking that he did this. I'm not going in thinking that he didn't do it. I'm just coming here to present, what I've found and what I have, and see what he says. One other thing to keep in mind is the morning of this interview, James actually had to have emergency dental surgery, and they removed several of his teeth, including some of his front teeth. So during this interview, he's got a swollen mouth. He's got He's in a lot of pain actually, but it was too important for him. He didn't want to reschedule. He didn't want to delay this at all. He wanted to get this interview out there and get it, out to the public. So, again, this is my interview with James Ferrara.
As clearly as you can, please state your name, your prison number, and your age.
All right. My name is Jim Ferrara, James Ferrara. My number is A177365. I'm 74 years old.
Take me to, you said you were convicted in 1983. Is that correct?
I believe so.
What were you convicted of?
Murder.
And what was your sentence?
I was sentenced to life imprisonment with parole eligibility in 20 years.
That was my next question, was your eligibility for parole. Okay, so you've been in prison, you said, since 1983.
Right.
And that was for, and we'll get into this later, but that was for a crime that was committed in the Columbus area.
Yes, sir.
Okay. What happened in 2009?
In 2009, while I was here at Marion Correctional Institution, I was taken back to Mahoning County and questioned on a cold case from Mahoning County.
You were brought to Mahoning County for questioning.
Mm-hmm.
Questioning what?
Questioning about murder case involving Ben Marsh and his family.
And what did you think about when they started questioning you on this case?
Well, I was shocked that I was even brought down there. I didn't know anything about that case. But I learned a lot about it because they questioned me on camera. They questioned me extensively. And then after they were done, they took me through the jail, out the door, put me in a car, and drove the car to the front of the jail and took me out, took me back up in the detective's office, and questioned me again. Took a DNA swab, and of course they had fingerprinted me and palm printed me numerous times while I was there.
Okay. Now, you worked at General Motors. Can you just tell me real quick, when did you work at General Motors?
I worked at General Motors. I started there November 30th of 1970.
Until when?
Until 83.
So you worked at General Motors at the same time that Benjamin Marsh worked there?
That's what I heard. I never knew Benjamin Marsh.
What did you know about Benjamin? You said you never heard of him at all?
No, I know that from other people and from the newspaper articles, I read that he was a security guard who worked second shift. I worked second shift, but I never met him. I worked pretty much throughout the whole plant. I worked for the UAW. I was a union representative, so I represented the material department, and that's line feeders and stockmen and tow motor drivers and anybody who stocked the lines, unloaded trucks, unloaded trains. So I went to the truck plant, I went to tri-level, I went through the whole car plant, upstairs and downstairs, all the departments had some form of material that people fed to the line that I represented.
Yeah.
So I pretty much went everywhere.
So, do you remember when you heard that Marsh was murdered?
You know, not really. I remember them posting a composite picture of the person that killed Ben Marsh on the bulletin board in the entranceway to General Motors. But as far as the details about the case, no. And since I didn't know him or his family, all I did was come to work every day.
How many people worked at GM back then?
Oh, 15,000.
And
Could be more, but at least 15,000. Now that's including the fab plant and the truck plant and the car plant. It was a big facility. It was a little city. I was a union rep. He was a security guard. Why would I have any contact with him? I mean, the security guards that I came in contact were the guys who were stationed at the time machines where you clocked in and clocked out, or the front door. So if they wanted to see what was in my briefcase, you know, they weren't allowed to. I had a union sticker on it. But I don't care. I showed it to them anyway. I didn't have nothing to conceal.
yeah. What did you hear happened to the Marshes? Did you hear anybody talking about it at the plant?
Well, I guess it happened around the Christmas time. And there was some conversations after we all got back to work. They talked about it, but nobody was, I didn't know nobody was questioned for it, arrested for it, or anything like that. They had a composite pictures of, like I said, the person posted on the bulletin board in the main lobby of the car plant. And probably in the truck plant too. I don't know. I never seen it over there.
Knowing what you know now, tell me what happened to the Marsh family.
It seems to me they were executed. Somebody went in there and killed them all.
And who are we talking about? Who all were killed?
Ben Marsh, his wife, and his daughter. There was a baby too, but the baby was not killed.
Yeah, a young daughter, right? Was killed. The child.
Yeah, there was a 4 or 5 year old daughter. She was killed.
The police would later say that they recovered your fingerprints off of a door outside that house. Are those your fingerprints?
No, sir.
How do you explain that?
I think that my name came up while they were questioning other people for other crimes. And once they got my name and questioned me, they needed prints. I think the prints that they wound up saying that they found at the scene of the crime were taken from me in 1983 when I got arrested for the crime I originally got locked up for. Because I wasn't there. I didn't know Ben Marsh. I'd never been to his house. And here's a funny story. I heard that a guy named Joe Perry got in trouble on a kidnapping and assault case. Him and his son got arrested. And he worked at the plant and knew of me. We weren't friends at all. I didn't particularly like the guy. But he mentioned my name in order for him and his son to get out of trouble. And the attorney that represented him was a guy named Anthony Moranto. And who do you think my attorney was that they gave me? Anthony Moranto. That's awful funny, isn't it? There's a lot. My whole case, from one end of it to the other, is filled with such humorous facts as that. And notice I say facts.
Now, there was a partially smoked cigarette found in the house, the Marsh house.
Right.
Do you smoke?
No, sir.
Have you ever smoked?
Never have.
So there's no way. There's obviously they didn't get you with any DNA on that.
They didn't get me with anything in the house. So they say they found fingerprints on the back door, and they found footprints. Whose footprints did they? They never took my footprints. They never even said the size of the shoe. They said they had footprints, they had DNA evidence, and they had fingerprints, but none of that stuff was mine.
All right, so.
But answer this question: they took me back in 2009 to question me about it. How come they didn't bring me back and try me for 4 more years after that? Was that to get a set of fingerprints from someplace, or get some evidence from somewhere, or to find some other evidence? I mean, they had arrested a guy.
Are we talking about Bobby Parks?
Yeah,
We'll get to him in a second.
Sure.
Let me just keep you on track here because I want to make sure we get everything in time.
According to the police investigation, Benjamin Marsh testified before a grand jury shortly before his death.
Right.
Regarding a theft ring out of GM Lordstown. What can you tell me about a theft ring there?
Anything?
No, sir.
Were stolen items ever sold at the plant?
Absolutely.
How do you know that?
Because people ask you if you want to buy something. Whether it's an air conditioner or a leather coat or anything you could think of. Firearms, rifles, drugs. There was always something for sale there, either in the parking lot or at the Union Hall. They had big sales, linen sales. They sold everything.
And, all right, now tell me, who was Bobby Parks?
All right. When I got here, I was assigned to work in the law library, and I worked with several other guys. One of them was named Don Hall, and he sold in K-Block with Bobby Parks. And we worked together for a couple of months, and he come up to me and said that he knew Bobby Parks from Youngstown, and he heard that Bobby Parks had heard that I was from Youngstown, and he wanted to meet me. So we made arrangements to meet on the yard. So we talked, and we had a lot of mutual friends. It turned out that Bobby Parks had once worked where I worked at Lordstown, but he left in 1968. And then it turned out that he was the best man at a good friend of mine's wedding, who was also the shop chairman of the whole union at Lordstown where I worked. So, obviously, when Bobby went back to his block, he called home and asked about me probably called some of the people we talked about. And they told him what kind of guy I was, what kind of person I was. And then I went back and got questioned in 2009. And when I come back, I talked to Bobby Parks, and he wanted to know what went on, and I told him the whole thing, and...
You told him that you were being questioned about the Marsh case.
Absolutely. And he said to me, he said, Jimmy, if I knew that they were going to mess with you about the Marsh case, he says, I would have just taken out for it because they questioned me about it too. He says, I'm already implicated in over 40 murder cases, 42 murder cases. He says, I'm not going nowhere. I'm booked solid. He said, I would have taken out for you. He said, that way they would have left you alone. And first I thought he was trying to be a decent guy until I went back for trial and I told my lawyer that there's a guy back there, and I mentioned his name, and he went and got his file and threw me his file. He said that guy wasn't questioned for it. He was arrested for it. But they let him go. Him, his brother, a third individual named Ed Ferris from Youngstown, who was an ex-police officer. They were all involved in, they did a lot of, I guess, murders and robberies and different types of criminal activity. But
did Bobby Parks ever say anything about committing any other crimes? Did he ever openly talk about things like that?
As a matter of fact, his cellie is a guy in this institution who celled with him for 9 years. He said the FBI was constantly coming down here questioning him about unsolved murders and also unsolved robberies. And I know he killed a guy outside. He went into a bar. This is the one thing he told me. One time he went into a bar and he knew one of the people that worked in the bar, and this black guy was having too much to drink, and he was giving the girl a hard time. So Bobby Parks told the guy to break it up, and the guy quit picking on the girl, and he could fight real good, and he beat up Bobby Parks, guffed him up pretty good, and Bobby Parks went out, got his gun, and waited for the guy to leave the bar. And when the guy left, he blew his brains out, got in the car, and drove away. He never got questioned about it. It's another unsolved murder. I'm sure Bobby had a lot of them. He told me his wife had testified against me. He went to kill this doctor in Youngstown, and the doctor lived, but he killed a nurse and he killed a receptionist. And she testified against him, and they got him on that one. But he was implicated in many others. I didn't know much about Bobby Parks until I went back for my trial. And then I met a guy I was incarcerated with in the county jail. His name was Tucci, and he was a friend of Paul Parks. And he told me about Bobby and Paul and what them guys did. They were the murder crew in Youngstown.
This is a piece of paper I can slide him, right? Okay. So I'll pull that out. And what I have here, this is a copy, this is an excerpt, this is a partial interview transcription from Detective Frank Martucci with the Akron Police Department and Detective Dave Moore of the Copley Police Department, both working on an organized crime task force, interviewing the ex-wife of Robert Bobby Parks on December 4th, 2001.
Right.
The ex-wife, who was at the time in witness protection, is referred to as Liz. If you would, could you read me that excerpt there?
Detective Moore, now continuing, Liz, when you were detective, when Detective Martucci and I spoke to you last, you had mentioned another conversation that you had overheard Bob make. Could you tell us a little bit about that conversation? Liz, yes, he was talking to Paul about the guy. It was some guy, and somebody wanted that guy killed, and he went ahead and went in the house to go do it, and and waited. I guess he had watched the house several times, been over to make sure no one was there but him. And the woman went back with her daughter after leaving the house. Maybe she forgot her purse or something and went back into that house. And by then, Bob had already committed the crime with that man and proceeded to shoot the woman, from what I understand, and beat the 4-year-old girl with the pistol, the butt of the pistol of the gun. Okay, do you remember an approximate year when you overheard that conversation? 76 or 77.
And the Paul that she's discussing there is his brother, Paul Parks.
Paul.
So,
have you ever read that before?
Never.
What do you think about that?
I think he killed Marsh, and I think Marsh's wife come back, and he killed the wife, and he killed anybody who can identify him. He didn't kill the baby because a baby can't identify him. And I think when he told me that, he was being truthful. That when he told me that if he knew that they were questioning or messing with me about it, he'd have taken out for it.
you really believe that?
Yes, I do believe that. And he was arrested for that group of guys broke into General Motors' security office and broke into Ben Marsh's file cabinet and stole the murder file. The file was supposed to contain the people who were snitching to Marsh about drugs and crimes that were happening at Lordstown. So,
And how do you know that about this file that was stolen? How do you know that?
I know that because there's a gentleman that wrote a book about the whole case, and I read the book.
That was mentioned, your lawyer mentioned that in your trial, is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Going back to your trial, what did you think of the state's case against you?
I didn't think they had a case against me. They said they had a fingerprint. At first, I was told it was a smudge print. Then, but they had no prints and no physical evidence, no DNA, nothing inside the house where the murder took place. But the place was full of prints and full of stuff. It was from people who lived there and touched things, and probably police officers and stuff like that. But does it surprise me that Bobby and his crew didn't leave prints at the scene of the crime? No. Does it surprise me that my prints were found on the outside of the garage? Yes. The fingerprint expert in my case didn't even testify. He was dead. They had an officer, Fenimore, who was a rookie deputy. He testified, but he didn't know anything. He was still learning the job. His testimony was pretty well covered by my attorney, but a lot of things weren't. I mean, Bobby Parks, I mean, a lot of people that were on the witness list were not called to testify because they would not have helped the state. What would have Joe Perry said? He would have said he heard from somebody else that said, he would have told you a bunch of baloney. a bunch of hearsay, and he would not have held up good on the cross-examination, since he gave that information up when he was under arrest for a kidnapping and assault case, him and his son. The Youngstown Vindicator in the news media crucified me before I went to trial, during the time I was at trial, and after trial. And what did they say? The prosecutor said their car was dumped a half a mile from where I lived in 1974. But I didn't move to Youngstown until 1976. I wasn't a resident there. She made it sound to the jury like I killed him, drove the car to the Kmart, slammed the door, and walked home. How did I even get to this crime? And not only that, the ballistics expert says that there were 3 guns that could have been fired at that time, not one, that 3 people could have been there. Bobby Parks, Paul Parks, and Eddie Ferris.
So you're saying, that, I want to go back and make that clear, you're at the car, Mrs. Marsh's car was taken after they were killed.
Right.
So the killer took the car and dumped it at a Kmart in nearby Austintown.
Yes, sir.
And in your trial in 2013, the prosecutor said that you lived nearby that Kmart.
Right.
And that's why you dropped the car there.
Right. Does that make any sense?
But that was 1974.
Yes.
And when did you move to that apartment?
1976.
What was the apartment's name? Do you remember?
Westchester Apartments
Westchester.
in Austintown.
Okay, so
And they could have contacted the phone company for when they installed the phone. You know, the apartment number was 312. I mean,
what did your lawyer say in court?
the defense went first. The prosecution followed up. He couldn't even question that when she told that to the jury in her closing arguments. He couldn't bring it up. That violated the rules of the court.
I see.
So the jury went to decide the verdict, thinking that I drove the car was parked a half a mile from where I lived, which was false.
So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and forgive me if we repeat anything here.
You know, one thing else.
Yeah.
The person who stole the car was seen at Kmart, and a person made a composite picture of them. That composite was published in the Youngstown Vindicator, and a copy of that composite was what was posted in the lobby of Lordstown where I worked, and in the truck plant, I think. But it was definitely posted in the lobby. And it was not a picture of me. It was a picture of somebody between 40 and 50. I was 24, 25 years old.
What does it mean to you personally that you were not only accused of these killings, but you were convicted?
Well, I was already doing time. And when they take somebody back to court that's already doing time, it's a slam dunk, because they portray you as a criminal. They tell everybody where you're coming from and stuff like that. So it's easy for a jury to jump from one crime to another. Oh, he's already killed people, so he might have did this, and he only lived a half a mile from where they dumped the car. Sure, it's and another thing about the jury. My jury consisted of people who are related to police officers, FBI agents, the post commanders for highway patrol, and victims of violent crime. Everybody on my jury was either a victim of violent crime or had a law enforcement background because they were related to a police officer or an FBI agent or somebody in the law enforcement with a law enforcement background.
So what are you saying?
What I'm saying is that the average person on jury duty was not on my jury. They were handpicked.
They were more willing, you would say, predisposed to agree with law enforcement.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, on the voir dire, they interviewed one woman, and that's why I'm saying this, because I remember what he said. She said her husband was an ex-FBI agent and a former air marshal, and her son was the post commander of the highway patrol, and if she was to give her, this is before my trial, and if she was to give an opinion on my guilt or innocence, she'd have to find me guilty. Now, this was before I even went, and they let her stay on the jury.
Wow. What does that say about your lawyer? I mean, how do you feel about your lawyer in that case?
I feel, when I found out that Joe Perry testified against me, and he represented Joe Perry, I found it very, very funny that he was assigned to represent me. Yeah, he did file motions for acquittal and dismissal on at least four occasions. And I felt the case should have been dismissed. There is no evidence. I didn't do anything. They found there was no they got a footprint where they kicked the door in. They didn't. What size footprint was that? Who did that? How come they didn't how come they didn't say that in court? No fingerprints within the house, in the kitchen. I mean, they're saying they described a bedroom. They had fingerprints on the door frames. Ben Marsh's paycheck was on a kitchen table where they said they found it, but they didn't find nothing of me in there. I wasn't in there. But they found 3 fingerprints on a door, 40-year-old prints that were degraded, smudged, and who knows if the fingerprint cards, if they could have done analysis of the handwriting or the ink or whatever, could have held up. I mean, the fingerprint expert, like I said, they didn't have one because the person who took my fingerprints, and that's another thing. The BCI woman said them fingerprints had been moved 4 or 5 different times. How do I know they weren't replaced by my 83 prints? Which I'm sure they were. Where else could they have gotten them? They had prints of me in the military. You know, I had all kind of prints. I had all kind of clearances. You name it.
What did you do in the military? Where'd you serve? What'd you serve?
I was in Vietnam, but...
in what branch?
I was in the Marine Corps.
All right. So real quick, I got a couple more I want to get to. I'll keep you back on track here.
Sure.
What do you hope comes of this interview?
I hope that they look at this case and realize that there is no case. And they either drop the charges on me or retry me and start questioning some of these witnesses. And not only that, fingerprints on the outside of a garage door don't constitute a murder. That doesn't mean that you murdered anybody. those are not my prints. I didn't commit that crime. But what I'm saying is, how did they make the leap from the outside door to the bedroom or to the inside the house? Then explain to me why. Bobby Parks' wife is in witness protection, and she testifies before the Organized Crime Commission that she overheard a conversation between her husband and her husband's brother, that he went to kill a guy, and the guy's family walked in on him, and he killed the guy's family. What other case is that? There's only one case like that in, 40, 50 years in Youngstown, and that's the Marsh killing. So they knew who committed the Marsh killing in 91. Why even bring me to
2001?
In 2000, why was I even brought to trial? Cleaned up a 40-year-old homicide. Sure you did.
Do you, you mentioned that with your first case, you were eligible for parole after, what, 20 years?
I would have been paroled.
So, if you were to get a retrial in this case,
Yes.
Do you believe that?
I don't believe they'd try me. I don't think there's evidence. There's obviously no witness. Everybody's dead.
Yeah.
There's no evidence of me at the crime scene.
so let me ask, do you have any hope for parole?
Oh, of course I have parole. I did my time. I pled guilty at my hearing. 2 guys tried to kill me. I killed them. I went to court on it. I told them what happened. They found me guilty. They said I suffered from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They said I was on a tremendous amount of stress, and I had a perfect institutional record. I'd have been home by now. Or at least I would have had a very good opportunity of being home right now, instead of going back to Youngstown on this baloney. And the thing about it is, a lot of people in Youngstown know me. A lot of people in Youngstown know I didn't do this. I'm not capable of killing a kid. That's crazy. Nobody does that. That's sickening. But professional killers do that, because kids can testify. They can pick out witnesses.
All right, so I want to get to your first case, but
Sure.
before we do, what would you do if you become a free man?
I'm retired. Go on Social Security and go fishing.
Enjoy your life, huh?
What's left of it? 40 years in prison.
Where are you from?
Originally,
Yeah.
Brooklyn, New York.
And what brought you to Ohio?
Well, school busing in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. I lived in Ridgewood, Queens. My mother had an aunt that lived in Mansfield, Ohio. A small, quiet, nice community in Ohio. So I moved in with her. My family moved there, where she immediately worked me and my brother as a slave. But that's okay, because it was nice there. And then, as I got older, I joined the Marine Corps. I got wounded in Vietnam. I come back. I got a job at General Motors. Moved to Youngstown. Met some people. I was pretty much a loner in Youngstown too. I didn't. I had a couple of girlfriends, but I wasn't a party animal. I didn't get high. I wasn't a drinker. I wasn't a social butterfly. I got a job in the union. I represented 160 people, and that's what I did. I worked a lot of overtime.
At General Motors Lordstown.
Lordstown, yeah. I bought a house for my mother. I looked after my family, and I was moving out of my apartment. I moved in with my girlfriend.
Which apartment was that? Do you remember where?
Yeah, it was Westchester, where it was living in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
It was time. I had been here long enough, and I had fits of depression, and I was, and a couple of guys befriended me when I got sick, when I was in the hospital, and when I got out of the hospital, I had pneumonia, which I caught from Al Ali's kids.
So real quick, I'm just going to speed you up because we're running out of time here. So
Right.
Tell me who are these two guys you befriended?
Joe Weeks and Mark Jennings, who both testified against me.
Who were they, real quick?
They were my co-defendants.
But I mean, to you, before the case. Who?
Oh, just Joe Weeks was a guy who worked with me
Where?
at Lordstown, and Mark Jennings was a friend of his, a mechanic. Their side business was dealing drugs and stealing cars.
Did you do drugs?
No.
So why hang out with these guys?
No, because Joe Weeks was a zone man in the union. I worked a lot of overtime, so I worked with a lot of guys, union guys.
And what
Joe Weeks was one of them. We became friends, friendly in the plant.
and quickly walk me through. So what happened then?
Well, they helped me move, so now I owed them a favor. So they were dealing drugs with their family in Columbus, Ohio. And they got this bunch of cocaine on a consignment, but they started using it, so they couldn't return it, and they didn't have the money to pay for it. So they thought about, let's have a phony robbery. And they asked me to make a couple of phone calls for them, pretending to be a person, and they were supposed to go down there and rob the guy, but they knew the guys that were robbing. It was Jennings' cousin and Jennings' cousin's wife were all in on the robbery. So they conned me into going down there. I knocked on the door. We already knew where the drugs were. Joe Weeks knocks me out of the way, runs in there, starts yelling at the guy, "Where's the shit, where is it?" Pretends to knock the guy down, and then he attacks the other guy. But the guy he pretended to knock down wasn't unconscious. Joe Weeks knew where the drugs were, so he kept asking, "Where are the drugs?" And the guy he was slapping around wouldn't say nothing about it. So the other guy was signaling the other guy the drugs to where the drugs were. We already knew where the drugs were. So the guy sees the one guy signal him, and he knows it's a setup. So he's a karate expert. He starts kicking me and attacking me. And the other guy jumps on my back. Joe Weeks just takes the drugs and leaves. Mark Jennings never comes in because he didn't want to be recognized, his voice. So I wound up shooting the guys and staggering out of the place because he had hurt me pretty bad. Next thing, I'm in a prison hospital being treated for my wounds, and Next thing I know, I'm being tried for robbery and murder. And Joe Weeks gets a lawyer, and his lawyer, they put it on me. It's okay, I killed the guys. I admitted it. And I told them why. But the reason being is because Joe Weeks was supposed to go in there. We were supposed to take the guys and put them in the closet, close the door, get the drugs, and leave. But no, he had to do all this other shit. I hear he's dead now too, though. You can't use him either.
Yeah, you're the last one standing.
Yeah.
So you admitted to that crime.
Absolutely.
Why?
Because I did it. It was the guy attacked me. He started kicking me. He kicked me in the head. He kicked me in the nuts. And the other guy was on my back. So I had a gun, I shot him. Then the guy who was on my back, I shot him. And I staggered out of there.
Had you ever been arrested for anything before this?
Never.
No criminal record at all?
No criminal record, no.
So
when I was 16 years old, I was arrested in Detroit, Michigan for criminal tools, possession of a crowbar, and possession of a pair of binoculars. They arrested me. They charged me. I got a $25 fine and let go. I'd never been involved in any criminal activity whatsoever in my whole life.
So I got to ask you, these guys help you move. You help them with this robbery. That's a big step up. I mean,
yes, it is. It didn't start out like that. Like I told you what it was supposed to happen. I was supposed to knock on the door. The guy was going to open it. Joe Weeks supposed to run in there. We were supposed to put these guys in a closet, lock the door, get the drugs, and leave. All they could say is they got robbed. But Joe Weeks wanted to make it look like they were really robbed for the drugs, so he wanted to slap them around and make them look bad. The one guy was in on it, the one guy wasn't. The one guy that was in on it was signaling Joe Weeks where the drugs were, and the other guy seen it. Okay. So they went crazy.
So okay, so you committed these these murders. You killed these two guys in a drug deal gone wrong.
Right.
Drug robbery gone wrong.
Right.
You've admitted to it. You pleaded guilty.
Right. They gave me the minimum sentence they could give me under the law.
And you would be eligible for parole today if you weren't.
Oh, was eligible years ago.
Yeah. So, do you have any regrets?
Oh, sure. I regret I ever met Joe Weeks. I regret that I ever killed two guys, two drug addicts, who ripped off the drug dealer. Yeah, I regret it all.
So I asked you a question earlier, and I'm going to ask you the same question again.
Sure.
So what does it mean to you personally to be accused of killing the Marsh family?
I had friends out there, very good, close friends. After that happened, they're no longer friends of mine because, I was convicted. If they overturn this, these are friends who stuck with me during the first trial. They're no longer stuck with me during the second one. They would come back into my life. They would realize that I did not kill Ben Marsh or his family. That means a lot to me.
Is there anything that you want to say that we didn't cover?
No, sir. Well, you and me have talked a lot, and you have done a lot of investigation. based on stuff that you've uncovered, do you think I killed these people?
I don't.
That's good, because I didn't. Thank you.
Jim, I want to thank you for your time.
Yes.
And please, real quick, tell me, you had surgery this morning, is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
What happened? What?
Had 2 teeth pulled here in the front. It's been very painful here, too.
Well, I thank you for
Gritting through it.
Well, I told you I would.
I appreciate it. And Jim, I appreciate your candid, your honesty and
Yeah.
and opening up and
Well, you're from that area. Like I said, you will meet a lot of people who know me. They'll tell you all I did was help people. Unfortunately, I met a lot of disreputable people. And, yeah, did I know they were disreputable? Yeah. I met Milano, Bill Milano. He threatened to kill Ben Marsh, and he threatened to kill Gary Bonnell, the one who wrote the book. And he was a disreputable guy. But I knew him well. And I met a lot of them guys.
I'm sorry. Last thing here, Jim. There was the daughter was killed. You were convicted of killing Benjamin Marsh, his wife, and the 4-year-old daughter.
Correct.
There was a baby that survived that was unharmed.
Right.
They found in the crime scene.
Right.
That baby's now got to be, an adult and is almost 50 years old. Do you have anything to say to Chris Marsh?
Yes, Chris. I know you didn't testify at my trial, that you refused, and I understand why. But I didn't kill your family. I want you to know that. And I think that Bobby Parks and his crew killed them. I think they were hired to kill him. And I think they were hired because I think your father uncovered a drug trafficking ring in the truck plant. And he was going to testify shortly against the people he thought were bringing drugs through the plant. And I think that's why he was killed. I think it was a hurry-up job. I think somebody was called on the phone and told him to take care of this guy.
All right, Jim. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Not everybody's guilty.
You have an interesting life, Mr.
Absolutely. I've outlived a lot of bad guys.
Keep on living.
Hope so.
Keep on living. Hopefully you get that parole, huh?
Yep.
That was an amazing podcast from an amazing podcast company. If you enjoyed the show, please click the like and subscribe buttons and share it with your friends. It goes a long way in helping us produce more amazing content.